March 7, 1943. Naval Air Station, Quonset Point, Rhode Island. Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn sat in the ready room staring at a blackboard covered in chalk diagrams. Arrows curved and twisted across the surface, representing the dance of death that was aerial combat. But one instruction, written in bold letters at the top, contradicted everything he'd been taught at flight school. Never turn with the enemy, roll through them. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The words felt wrong. Every instinct screamed that in a dogfight you turned to face your opponent, you matched their maneuvers, you outflew them. But the officer briefing the new Hellcat squadron was adamant. The old rules were dead. The Zero had killed them. What replaced those rules would become the most devastating tactical innovation in the Pacific Air War, a technique so counterintuitive that it took months for pilots to trust it, yet so effective that it would produce kill ratios approaching 19-1. This is the story of how American naval aviators learned to exploit a vulnerability so fundamental that Japanese pilots never saw it coming until it was too late. And it begins not with courage or superior machinery alone, but with a single captured aircraft lying in the mud of a forgotten Alaskan island. By early 1943, the Pacific War had reached a brutal equilibrium. Japanese forces still held vast territories stretching from Burma to the Marshall Islands. Their naval aviation, though bloodied at Midway, remained a deadly threat. The Mitsubishi A6M0 continued to dominate close-range combat with its legendary maneuverability. American pilots flying the F6F Wildcat had developed tactics to survive, the thatch weave being the most famous, but survival was not victory. The Wildcat was tough and reliable, but it was slower than the Zero, climbed more slowly, and couldn't match its turning radius. Pilots who forgot these limitations died quickly. The tactical doctrine was purely defensive. Stay in pairs, cover each other, never fight alone, and above all, never try to turn with a Zero. It worked well enough to prevent catastrophic losses, but it couldn't win air superiority. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Then, in the summer of 1942, everything changed. On Akutan Island in the Aleutians, a nearly intact Zero had been recovered from a bog. Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga had attempted an emergency landing, but the seemingly solid grassland was actually marsh. His aircraft flipped, killing him instantly, but leaving the fighter remarkably preserved. What followed was perhaps the most important intelligence coup of the Pacific Air War. The captured Zero was shipped to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, restored to flying condition, and exhaustively tested. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders flew 24 test flights, pushing the aircraft through every maneuver, every speed regime, every conceivable flight condition. The data he collected was revolutionary, not because it revealed the Zero's strengths, those were already painfully well known, but because it exposed weaknesses American pilots could exploit. Sanders discovered that while the Zero was supremely agile below 200 knots, its controls stiffened dramatically at higher speeds. The ailerons, those control surfaces governing roll rate, became nearly immovable above 230 miles per hour. In practical terms, this meant the Zero could barely roll at speeds where American fighters were just reaching their optimal performance envelope. Even more critical was the engine behavior. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai 14-cylinder radial used a float-type carburetor, a simple and lightweight design perfectly suited to Japan's industrial capabilities and the Zero's weight-saving philosophy. But float carburetors have a fatal flaw. Under negative G-forces, when an aircraft pushes into a dive, gravity can't hold the fuel in the float chamber. The mixture becomes erratic or cuts out entirely, causing the engine to sputter or die. Sanders proved this repeatedly. Every time he pushed the Zero into a steep dive, particularly one involving negative G loading, the engine faltered. It would restart once positive G-forces returned, but for several crucial seconds, the Zero became a powerless glider while its opponent's engine roared at full power. This was the key. This was the vulnerability that would reshape American fighter tactics and cost Japan thousands of aircraft and pilots. But knowing the weakness and exploiting it were two different things. American fighters of 1942, primarily the Wildcat, lacked the performance to fully capitalize on this discovery. The Wildcat was too slow, too heavy on the controls, and lacked the power-to-weight ratio to execute the high-speed diving attacks that would exploit the Zero's carburetor problem. What was needed was a new fighter, one designed from the outset to dominate at high speeds, to roll quickly at any velocity, and to carry enough armor and firepower to survive and win in close combat. That fighter was already on the drawing boards at Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation on Long Island, New York. It was called the F6F Hellcat. Grumman's founder, Leroy Grumman, and his chief engineer, William Schwendler, had been working on a Wildcat replacement since 1941. Early combat reports from the Pacific made clear that American carrier fighters were outclassed. The initial design studies for what would become the Hellcat began in June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. But the project accelerated dramatically after Midway, when the true scale of the Zero threat became undeniable. The Hellcat's design philosophy was the opposite of the Zero's. Where the Zero saved weight at all costs, the Hellcat embraced mass. Where the Zero relied on agility, the Hellcat prioritized speed and diving performance. Where the Zero left its pilot vulnerable, the Hellcat surrounded him with armor plate and bulletproof glass. The result was an aircraft that weighed over 15,000 pounds fully loaded, nearly twice the Zero's combat weight. Powering this substantial machine was the Pratt & Whitney R2-800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. This gave the Hellcat a top speed of 380 miles per hour at 19,000 feet, faster than the Zero in level flight and vastly superior in dives. But speed alone wasn't the innovation. The critical advantage was roll rate. Grumman's engineers designed the Hellcat with large, powerful ailerons and a hydraulically boosted control system that remained responsive at high speeds. Where the Zero's roll rate degraded to nearly zero above 230 miles per hour, the Hellcat could execute a full 360-degree roll in less than 2 seconds at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. This capability was not accidental. It was engineered specifically to exploit what the captured Zero had revealed. The tactical implications were profound, but not immediately obvious to the pilots who would fly the Hellcat into combat. Lieutenant Commander Blackburn, sitting in that ready room at Quonset Point in March 1943, was among the first to learn what this new capability meant in practice. The instructor, Commander James Flatley, had flown Wildcats at Coral Sea and Midway. He'd survived by mastering defensive tactics, but he'd also studied every scrap of intelligence from the captured Zero. Now, standing before the first Hellcat squadron preparing for deployment, he was teaching a doctrine that inverted everything American pilots had learned. "The Zero wants you to turn," Flatley explained, tapping the blackboard. "Every Japanese pilot has been trained since his first flight to enter a turning engagement. Their aircraft is built for it. Their tactics assume it. When you turn with a Zero, you fight on his terms, and on his terms, he wins." He drew a new diagram. 2 aircraft, one diving from above, the other turning to meet it. "Here's what you do instead. You come in fast, 300 knots or more, from altitude. The Zero sees you coming and turns to meet you. This is his instinct, his training, his expectation. But you don't turn with him. As you close, you roll, a hard, fast roll in the direction of his turn, cutting across his nose at high speed." Blackburn raised his hand. "Sir, if we roll away, aren't we giving him our back? He'll have a free shot." Flatley smiled grimly. "That's what you'd think. That's what he thinks. But watch what happens." He drew the maneuver in detail. When you roll, you're changing your flight path in 3 dimensions. You're not just turning left or right. You're spiraling through space at high speed. The Zero pilot tries to follow. He pulls hard, trying to get his nose around to track you. But remember what Sanders discovered. At high speed, the Zero can barely roll. Its ailerons lock up. So the Japanese pilot does what he's been trained to do. He pulls harder in the turn, trying to bring his guns to bear. But you're already rolling through his firing solution, moving perpendicular to his turn plane. He can't follow. His aircraft won't let him. Another pilot spoke up. What if he's smart enough to not turn? What if he just tries to extend away? Flatley nodded. Then you've won anyway. He's running. You chase him down, using your superior speed and diving performance. If he tries to dive away, his engine cuts out from the negative Gs. You catch him in seconds. If he tries to climb, you have more power and can follow. His only option is to turn, and if he turns, you roll through him again. The beauty of the tactic was its simplicity once the Hellcat's capabilities were understood. It required no complex formations, no intricate timing between multiple aircraft, though it worked even better when executed by a section of 2 or 4 fighters. It simply demanded that the pilot trust his aircraft's ability to change direction faster than the Zero could respond. But trust doesn't come easily when you're diving toward an enemy fighter at 300 miles per hour. The first combat test of these tactics came in August 1943 during operations against Marcus Island. Fighting Squadron 9, equipped with new F6F Hellcats, engaged a formation of Zeros, protecting the island's installations. Lieutenant Commander Philip Torrey led the first pass. Coming in from 22,000 feet, his division of 4 Hellcats spotted 6 Zeros orbiting at 15,000 feet. Torrey pushed over into a high-speed dive, accelerating past 320 miles per hour. The Zeros saw them coming and reacted exactly as expected. They turned hard, presenting their best turning performance, confident in their ability to outmaneuver any American fighter. Torrey held his dive until he was 2,000 feet above the Zeros, then rolled inverted and pulled through, coming out in a slashing attack from the side. The lead Zero pilot yanked his stick over, trying to roll and turn into Torrey's Hellcat. His aircraft responded sluggishly. At that speed, his ailerons were nearly useless. By the time he'd managed a 45-degree bank, Torrey had rolled completely through his firing line, machine guns hammering. The Zero came apart, its unarmored fuel tanks exploding in an orange fireball. Torrey's wingman followed through in the same rolling attack, destroying a second Zero before it could react. The remaining Japanese pilots scattered, trying to dive away. 2 of them made the fatal mistake of pushing into negative G dives. Their engines coughed and died. Hellcats fell on them like hawks on field mice. The entire engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. All 6 Zeros were destroyed. Not a single Hellcat was damaged. When Torrey landed back on the carrier Essex, he was almost euphoric. It worked exactly like they said it would. They couldn't follow the roll. They couldn't dive away. Once we committed to the attack, they had no answer. Word spread rapidly through the Pacific Fleet's fighter squadrons. More importantly, combat footage and gun camera film from these early engagements was analyzed in detail. What the analysts saw confirmed the tactical theory perfectly. In engagement after engagement, Zeros attempted to turn into rolling Hellcat attacks. In every case, by the time the Zero pilot managed to reverse his bank and pull his nose toward the Hellcat, the American fighter had already rolled through 180 degrees or more and was either engaging from a new angle or extending away at high speed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tactic acquired several names among the pilots. Some called it the rolling scissors, others the high-speed yo-yo, but most simply called it rolling through, a phrase that captured the essence of the maneuver. You didn't fight around the Zero, you fought through it, using 3-dimensional maneuvering at speeds where the Japanese aircraft became aerodynamically helpless. By October 1943, the tactical revolution was complete. Every Hellcat squadron in the Pacific had adopted rolling attack techniques as standard doctrine. Training programs at Naval Air Station Glenview in Illinois and NAS Purcell in Oklahoma incorporated the maneuvers into basic fighter curriculum. New pilots arriving in theater already understood the principles. They'd practiced against other Hellcats in mock combat, learning to trust the aircraft's roll rate and high-speed handling. But understanding principles in training and executing them under fire were different matters entirely. The real test came during Operation Galvanic, the invasion of the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. This would be the largest naval engagement since Midway, and Japanese commanders knew it. They committed every available aircraft from their island bases, determined to stop the American advance. On November 20th, radar operators aboard the escort carrier Liscombe Bay detected a massive inbound raid. 73 Japanese aircraft, mostly Zeros and Betty bombers, were approaching the invasion fleet at low altitude. Fighting Squadron 24, flying from the carrier Belleau Wood, scrambled to intercept. 23 Hellcats climbed rapidly to gain the altitude advantage that made their tactics possible. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, already a Medal of Honor recipient from his service in Wildcats, led the squadron. He'd spent weeks drilling his pilots on the rolling attack technique. Now, at 11,000 feet with the sun behind them, they spotted the Japanese formation below at 6,000 feet. O'Hare's voice crackled over the radio. "Remember your training. Don't turn with them. Roll through and extend." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The Hellcats pushed over. Within seconds, they were screaming down at over 350 miles per hour. The Zeros escorting the bombers saw them coming and broke formation, turning hard to meet the attack. It was exactly the wrong response. The 1st Division of Hellcats rolled inverted and pulled through at an oblique angle to the Zero formation. Machine guns opened up, 6 50 caliber Brownings per aircraft, firing over 2,000 rounds per minute combined. 3 Zeros exploded in the first 5 seconds of combat. The Japanese pilots who survived the initial pass tried desperately to reverse their turns and track the Hellcats, but the American fighters were already rolling through again from a different angle. One Japanese pilot, Petty Officer First Class Kiyoshi Ito, later described the engagement in his diary, which was recovered after the war. "The new American fighters do not behave like aircraft. They tumble through the sky at impossible speeds. When we turn to engage, they are already behind us or above us or coming from an angle we cannot follow. Our Zeros respond too slowly at these speeds. By the time we can roll our wings, level and pull, they have disappeared. Then they return from another direction. We are fighting shadows." The battle raged for 18 minutes. When it was over, 31 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, including 17 Zeros. Fighting Squadron 24 lost 1 Hellcat. Its pilot recovered safely after ditching near a destroyer. The kill ratio was 31-1 if you counted only losses, 17-1 if you counted only the Zeros. These numbers seemed impossible, yet they were verified by multiple sources, including gun camera footage, shipboard observers, and Japanese records captured after the war. But Galvanic was just the beginning. As 1944 began, Hellcat production reached full stride. Grumman's factory in Bethpage, New York, was producing over 500 aircraft per month. By mid-year, nearly every carrier in the Pacific Fleet operated Hellcat squadrons. The Japanese, meanwhile, were struggling. Zero production had peaked at under 300 aircraft per month and was declining as American submarines strangled raw material shipments. Worse still, Japan's pilot training program had collapsed under the weight of attrition. Before the war, Japanese naval aviators underwent rigorous training, lasting 2-3 years, accumulating over 700 flight hours before their first combat mission. By early 1944, new pilots were arriving at frontline squadrons with barely 150 hours total flight time, most of it in trainers. Many had never fired their guns at a moving target. Many had never practiced formation flying at night. These inexperienced pilots stood no chance against the rolling attack technique, where veteran Japanese aviators might recognize the trap and attempt to fight vertically or disengage entirely. Green pilots did what their limited training had taught them. They turned, and when they turned, they died. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrasiu, who would become the Navy's 4th-ranking ace, described the brutal simplicity of these engagements. By mid-1944, Fighting Zeros was like shooting ducks. They'd see you coming and go into a hard turn, exactly like the textbook said. You'd roll through their turn, and they'd just sit there in your gun sight, unable to follow. Sometimes you could get 2 or 3 in a single diving pass before you even had to think about extending away. It wasn't brave, it wasn't even particularly skillful anymore, it was just arithmetic. They turned, we rolled, they died. The statistics bore out WWII's grim assessment. In January 1944, Hellcat squadrons recorded kill ratios averaging 12-1. By March, this had risen to 15-1. In April, during operations against the Palau Islands, some squadrons reported ratios exceeding 20-1. These numbers were so extraordinary that some Navy analysts initially suspected they were exaggerated, the result of multiple pilots claiming the same victories or mistaking damaged aircraft for kills. A comprehensive review of combat film, Japanese loss records, and cross-referenced American claims proved the numbers were accurate, if anything slightly understated. The Hellcat, combined with the rolling attack technique, had created a level of air superiority unprecedented in modern warfare. But the ultimate demonstration came in June 1944 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, an engagement that would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese carrier force. He had 9 carriers and over 400 aircraft, the largest concentration of Japanese naval air power since Midway 2 years earlier. Ozawa believed he had several advantages. His aircraft had longer range than American fighters, allowing him to strike first while staying beyond the enemy's reach. He also expected land-based aircraft from the Marianas to join the battle, overwhelming the Americans with numbers. What Ozawa didn't know was that American submarines had already detected his fleet. He didn't know that land-based aircraft had been destroyed in pre-invasion strikes, and he didn't know that the technical and tactical advantages his pilots once enjoyed were gone. On the morning of June 19th, Ozawa launched his first strike. 69 aircraft, mostly Zeros and Judy dive bombers, headed toward the American fleet. They were detected by radar while still 70 miles away. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, ordered a fighter sweep. Over 200 Hellcats launched from 11 carriers, climbing to optimal attack altitude. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, leading Fighting Squadron 15 from the carrier Essex, spotted the incoming raid at 25,000 feet. The Japanese formation was spread out, struggling to maintain cohesion. "This is it," Brewer radioed his pilots. "Same as we've practiced. High side, roll through, don't chase." The Hellcats dove. What followed was less a battle than an execution. The Japanese pilots, many with less than 100 hours total flight time, reacted instinctively to the diving attack. They turned. The Hellcats rolled through their turns at speeds exceeding 330 miles per hour. Zero after zero exploded or spun away, trailing smoke and flame. Ensign Wilbur, spider web of VF2, described watching a Japanese pilot's final moments through his gun sight. He was turning as hard as he could, probably pulling 4 or 5 Gs. I rolled right through his turn circle, barely had to adjust my aim. My tracers walked up his fuselage from tail to cockpit. He never changed his bank angle, never tried to roll away or dive. He just kept turning until my bullets cut him apart. I don't think he knew any other way to fight. The first Japanese strike was annihilated. Of 69 aircraft, 42 were shot down. Only 6 managed to attack the fleet, and they scored no hits. Ozawa, unaware of the disaster, launched a second wave. 128 aircraft this time, a massive commitment that stripped his carriers of fighters. The Americans were waiting. More Hellcats had been launched to maintain combat air patrol strength. The second wave met the same fate as the first. This time, the kill ratio was even more lopsided. 97 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The Hellcats used the same rolling attacks, exploiting the same vulnerabilities. Japanese pilots who survived the initial pass tried to run, diving for the ocean surface or the cover of clouds, but the Hellcat's superior speed and diving characteristics made escape impossible. If a Zero pilot pushed into a negative G dive, His engine quit. Hellcats fell on him before he could restart it. Ozawa launched 2 more strikes that day, each smaller than the last as his air groups were bled white. By the time the sun set on June 19th, the Japanese had lost over 300 aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. American losses were 29 aircraft, most to anti-aircraft fire rather than aerial combat. Of the fighters lost in air-to-air combat, the number was 6. The kill ratio for the day approached 50-1 when accounting for all Japanese losses. For Hellcats specifically engaging Zeros, the ratio was over 19-1. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was catastrophic. Warrant Officer Sakai Yamashita, one of the few experienced aviators to survive the battle, wrote in his diary that night, "The Americans have learned to fly through dimensions we cannot follow. Our Zeros are now toys in their hands. The young pilots die before they understand what killed them. Those of us who survive know that survival is temporary. We are fighting an enemy who has surpassed us in every measurable way." Yamashita's assessment was accurate. The rolling attack technique had transformed the Hellcat from merely a superior aircraft into an unstoppable weapon system. Japanese commanders understood this. In the months following the Philippine Sea, tactical directives changed. Zeros were instructed to avoid engagement with Hellcats whenever possible. If combat was unavoidable, pilots were ordered to attack in large groups, hoping that numerical superiority might compensate for tactical and technical disadvantages. It didn't work. In August 1944, during operations against the Bonin Islands, Fighting Squadron 31 engaged a formation of 18 Zeros with just 8 Hellcats. Using coordinated rolling attacks, the Americans destroyed 13 Zeros in 12 minutes without loss. The Japanese pilots never managed to organize an effective defense. Every time they turned to engage, Hellcats rolled through their firing solutions faster than they could respond. By September, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force. The few remaining experienced pilots were held in reserve for defense of the home islands. New pilots, some with as little as 60 hours total flight time, were being trained for one-way kamikaze missions. The logic was brutal but sound. If a pilot couldn't hope to survive combat against Hellcats, his aircraft might, as to the logic, well be a manned missile. At least that way, his death might achieve something. The final accounting of the Hellcats' war record is staggering. Between 1943 and 1945, Hellcats destroyed 5,163 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. They lost 370 aircraft to enemy fighters, an overall kill ratio of nearly 14-1. Against the Zeros specifically, the ratio was even higher. Hellcats destroyed over 3,000 Zeros while losing approximately 150 in Zero versus Hellcat engagements, a ratio of 19.5-1. These numbers represented more than technical or tactical superiority. They represented the complete collapse of Japan's air defense capability. By early 1945, American carriers operated with near impunity off the Japanese coast. The skies over Okinawa, and eventually over Japan itself, belonged entirely to the United States. The Zero, which had terrorized the Pacific for 2 years, had become little more than a target. Yet the story's most profound irony lies in its origin. The rolling attack technique that destroyed Japanese air power was made possible by a single Zero that crashed in an Aleutian bog. Tadayoshi Koga's emergency landing, meant to save his life and preserve his aircraft for future use, instead gave America the intelligence needed to defeat his nation in the skies. The weaknesses exposed by that captured fighter, the heavy controls at high speed, the carburetor failures under -G, became the foundation of tactics that killed thousands of his fellow pilots. Some historians argue that Japan lost the air war due to industrial disparity, that American production capacity simply overwhelmed Japanese manufacturing. This is true, but incomplete. Numbers matter, but tactics matter more. The Hellcat's 19-1 kill ratio wasn't achieved solely through numerical superiority. It was achieved because American pilots learned to fight in a way that made the Zero's strengths irrelevant and its weaknesses fatal. The rolling attack technique required three elements to work. First, an aircraft capable of high-speed maneuvering, specifically one with effective roll control at speeds where the Zero became sluggish. The Hellcat provided this. Second, pilots trained and confident enough to execute the maneuver under combat stress, trusting their aircraft's capabilities over their instincts. American naval aviation provided this through extensive training programs that gave pilots over 600 hours of flight time before combat. Third, and perhaps most critical, an enemy locked into tactical doctrine that played directly into the trap. Japanese training emphasized turning combat above all else. Pilots were taught that the Zero's superior maneuverability was their greatest weapon. This belief, justified in 1941 and 1942, became a death sentence in 1944. Institutional inertia and the collapse of Japan's training system meant that even when the tactical situation changed, Japanese pilots continued fighting the way they'd been taught. By war's end, a small number of surviving Japanese aces understood what had happened. Saburo Sakai, Japan's third-ranking ace with 64 victories, reflected in his post-war memoir, "We were taught that the warrior spirit would overcome material disadvantages. We believed that our training and our aircraft's agility made us superior. Then the Americans learned to fight in a way that made agility meaningless. They didn't try to outturn us. They rolled through us at speeds we couldn't match. Our warrior spirit meant nothing when our aircraft couldn't follow their maneuvers." The Hellcat remained in frontline service through the end of the war. The last aerial victories were recorded on August 15, 1945, the day Japan surrendered. Even as the war ended, Hellcats were being produced at a rate of over 400 per month. Grumman's factories had built 12,275 Hellcats by the time production ceased. The Zero, by comparison, had a total production run of 10,450 aircraft over its entire service life. In the decades after the war, the Hellcat was quickly retired from American service, replaced by jet fighters. But its legacy endured in the lessons it taught about the relationship between technology, tactics, and training. Superior equipment alone doesn't win wars. The Hellcat was a better aircraft than the Zero, but not overwhelmingly so. In a turning fight at low speeds, the Zero remained more maneuverable until the very end. What made the difference was understanding. American pilots learned to avoid the fight the Zero could win and impose the fight the Hellcat dominated. They learned to roll through rather than turn with their opponents. They learned that three-dimensional thinking at high speeds defeated two-dimensional maneuvering at low speeds. These lessons, paid for with the lives of pilots on both sides, reshaped aerial combat doctrine for generations. Today, the principles established by Hellcat pilots remain relevant. Modern fighter tactics still emphasize energy management, three-dimensional maneuvering, and exploiting an opponent's weaknesses rather than matching their strengths. The specific techniques have evolved, the aircraft are unrecognizably different, but the fundamental insight remains. Know your enemy's limitations, know your own capabilities, fight in the regime where you have advantage, and deny the enemy the fight they want. The 19-to-1 kill ratio, achieved by Hellcat pilots rolling through Zeros, stands as one of the most lopsided victories in the history of air combat. It began with intelligence from a captured aircraft. It was enabled by engineering that created a fighter with superior high-speed handling. It was executed by pilots trained to trust their aircraft and their tactics over their instincts, and it ended Japanese air superiority in the Pacific, paving the way for victory. From the bogs of Akutan to the skies over the Philippine Sea, from the blackboards at Quonset Point to the gun camera footage that documented thousands of victories, this is the story of how American naval aviators learned to roll through their enemies, and in doing so, changed the course of the war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.